Breaking news in the search for Nancy Guthrie. Newly released doorbell video shows a person wearing a mask and armed with a gun outside her home.
By the Pima County Sheriff's Department and the FBI. In that video, you see a masked person, appears to be armed with a gun, going towards the doorbell. And if you remember from some of the video we showed you in previous stories, there's a missing doorbell. The doorbell's not there. You see the rack it should be set on, but it's not there. This video they put out there, they want people to look at it. Contact the FBI if you think you know who it is. Unfortunately, as you can see there, the person is covered up. This now, as they continue to look for Nancy Guthrie. Nancy Guthrie, like we said, was kidnapped, they believe, abducted from her.
It is just after midnight in the Catalina foothills, north of Tucson, Arizona. The desert is silent. The neighborhood is one of the most affluent in the entire state. Sprawling homes tucked against the Santa Catalina Mountains, wide driveways, cacti standing like sentinels in manicured front yards. Nothing ever happens here. That is what the neighbors always say. Inside one of those homes, an 84-year-old woman is alone. She had just come home from her daughter's house a few hours earlier. A warm family evening, dinner, laughter, board games. Her Uber had pulled away at 9:48 in the evening. She had walked inside. The garage door had closed behind her. Everything was fine. But sometime in the black hours that follow, sometime between 1:47 in the morning, when her doorbell camera goes dark, and 2:28 a.m., when her pacemaker stops syncing to her phone, something happens inside that house that will grip an entire nation for months. Her phone stays behind. Her medications stay behind. Her personal belongings, everything a woman would take if she left of her own free will. They all stay behind. What is found instead will make investigators go cold. There is blood on the front porch. And the doorbell camera? It has been physically removed from the wall. Someone was in that house. Someone who had been watching, waiting, and planning. Someone who knew exactly where she lived, when she would be home, and how to make her disappear without a trace. And as of today, that someone has never been identified. Nancy Guthrie has never been found. Welcome to Condemned Files. In today's case, the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old, the mother of NBC News journalist and Today co-anchor Savannah Guthrie. But to reduce her to that description would be to miss the woman entirely. She was known to those who loved her as sharp, warm, and deeply rooted in her faith. She had spent her later years living independently in Tucson, Arizona, a city she had chosen deliberately, close enough to family, far enough to maintain her own life on her own terms. Nancy had built her world around routine and community. She attended virtual church services regularly, checked in with friends and family, and made time for the people she loved. She had raised children who had gone on to remarkable lives, but she was not defined by their success. She was defined by her own quiet resilience, a woman who, even at 84, was not living an at-risk lifestyle, not according to detectives who would later study her life in minute detail. She lived in the Catalina foothills area of Tucson, an unincorporated affluent community north of the city, set against the dramatic backdrop of the Santa Catalina Mountains. Her neighbors were professionals and retirees. One neighbor, David Holter, who lived about a mile away, said the worst crime he could recall in the Catalina foothills across decades of living there was a suitcase stolen off a porch and a bicycle swiped. This was not a neighborhood where people locked their doors in fear. It was not a place where anyone imagined evil could find you. Nancy employed household staff and lived alone. She was close to her children, Savannah, Annie, and Cameron, and made time for all of them. On the last ordinary evening of her known life, she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she loved, having dinner with family. No one who knew her could have imagined what was coming. And that is what makes what happened next so profoundly disturbing. At 5:32 in the evening on Saturday, January 31st, 2026, Nancy Guthrie left her Catalina Foothills home in an Uber. She was headed to the home of her daughter, Annie Guthrie, and Annie's husband, Tommaso Tioni, for dinner and an evening of board games and family time. The Uber driver was later interviewed by investigators. The evening was unremarkable. Dinner, warmth, the ordinary comfort of family. She was dropped off at Annie's home in the Tucson area and spent the evening with family before being driven back to her Catalina Foothills residence. At 9:48 p.m. Mountain Time, the garage door at Nancy's home opened. 2 minutes later, it closed. That was the last confirmed sign of Nancy Guthrie entering her house alive. What she did not know, and what investigators would piece together only later, was that she was not alone that night. Someone was already aware of her comings and goings. Someone had been watching the house. Sources familiar with the investigation later told ABC News that the masked suspect appears to have been at Nancy Guthrie's front door earlier than February 1st. The image the FBI released of the suspect without a backpack was captured by her Nest doorbell camera sometime before the night she vanished. He had been there before. He had been casing the house. And on the night Nancy came home from a warm family dinner, he was ready. At 1:47 a.m., Nancy's doorbell camera disconnected. Then, at 2:28 a.m., on her pacemaker app lost contact with her phone. NBC News. The device that monitored her heart, that sent signals, that tracked her, went silent. In the hours that followed, the house sat still. Her phone sat on a surface inside. Her medications sat where she had left them. And Nancy Guthrie was gone. Sunday morning came quietly to the Catalina Foothills. The sun rose over the Santa Catalina Mountains and fell across the manicured yards and pale stone driveways of the neighborhood. Somewhere inside Nancy Guthrie's home, nothing moved. She was reported missing around noon on February 1st after she did not show up at a friend's house to watch Sunday morning virtual church services, a routine she followed faithfully. Family members who went to check on her found something wrong. The house was locked. Her car was there. Her phone was inside. Her medications, critical daily prescriptions, had not been taken. Deputies responding to the residents noted that Guthrie's personal belongings, including her phone and other essential items, were still inside the home. Given her limited mobility and the absence of any indication that she had left voluntarily, investigators immediately regarded the situation as more than a routine missing person report. Then they found the blood. Investigators later confirmed that blood found on the porch matched Guthrie's DNA, which they treated as evidence of a violent crime. There was enough blood near the front door that media cameras capturing the scene from a distance appeared to show a trail. Officials declined to comment on the extent of any injuries or the amount of blood. And then they found one more thing. In the doorbell camera, the Google Nest device mounted by her front door had been removed. Investigators confirmed it had been physically taken from the wall. Whoever had taken Nancy Guthrie had been prepared. They had dealt with the surveillance. They had taken the evidence with them. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos stood before cameras that Sunday and said what investigators already believed. "I believe she was abducted, yes," Nanos said. "She didn't walk from there. She didn't go willingly." By the afternoon of February 1st, 2026, the Catalina Foothills had transformed. The Pima County Sheriff's Department deployed search and rescue teams, including police dogs, drones, and aerial resources, with assistance from U.S. Customs and Border Protection. The mountains were searched. The desert scrubland was combed. Trails were walked. Helicopters moved in low sweeps across the terrain. Nothing was found. On February 2nd, authorities announced that the case had officially shifted from a search operation to a criminal investigation. This was not a woman who had wandered off. This was not a medical emergency that had taken her somewhere on foot. This was something far more deliberate, and law enforcement knew it. A multi-agency task force began to assemble. The investigation was led by the Pima County Sheriff's Department with assistance from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and search and rescue teams, and included extensive forensic analysis, neighborhood canvassing, and review of surveillance footage. FBI Special Agent in Charge, Hyth Janka, joined Sheriff Chris Nanos as the public faces of the investigation. Fabian Pacheco, on Chief of Detectives for the Pima County Attorney's Office, who oversaw one of the tip lines, would later tell CBS News, "It only takes one tip, just one, to break the case open, to offer that lead that we so desperately need in this case." Authorities canvassed residences, businesses, and government agencies for surveillance video to identify any possible indication of where Guthrie may have been taken. Reviewing the thousands of hours of footage was described as a painstaking process, often involving slowing video down frame by frame. Officials also began looking beyond the border. Due to the proximity of Tucson to the U.S.-Mexico border, both U.S. and Mexican border officials were briefed and placed on alert. Tucson sits just 60 miles from Mexico. If someone had driven south from the Catalina foothills that night, well, they could have crossed the border before sunrise. The question that was consuming investigators was not just where Nancy was. It was who had taken her and why. Within 72 hours of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, the Catalina foothills was no longer a quiet, private neighborhood. Swarms of media outlets and law enforcement officers descended on the community. Satellite trucks lined the road outside her home. Camera crews from every major national network staked out positions. There was News Nation, Fox and Friends, ABC's Good Morning America, CNN, NBC, stations from Los Angeles, and multiple local Arizona affiliates. Signs of support appeared almost immediately outside the house. On the third day, a sign appeared that read, "Dear Guthrie family, your neighbors stand with you." More than a month later, that sign had grown into a memorial stretching yards beyond it. Yellow ribbons, matching the vibrant flowers on the native brittlebrush plants, began dotting neighbors' mailboxes and cacti. Outside the local NBC station in Tucson, about 5 miles south of Guthrie's residence, a large banner appeared reading, "Bring her home." Messages of support came from around the world. Bend, Oregon, New York City, Scotland, Mexico. The case drew international attention, with Savannah Guthrie suspending her broadcasting duties, including coverage of the 2026 Winter Olympics, to participate in the ongoing search. Online, amateur sleuths pored over every detail. Streamers began showing up at the scene. Damian Enderle, a Tucson native, began daily live streams that racked up thousands of views. John DePetro, an independent journalist from Rhode Island who flew out expecting a story that would last a week, found himself still there on day 44. And through all of it, the family remained silent. At first, they were still processing, still hoping, still waiting for the phone to ring and a familiar voice to say she was okay. That phone never rang. And the silence from whoever had taken Nancy Guthrie was about to be broken in the most disturbing way imaginable. In the days after Nancy Guthrie vanished, forensic teams worked methodically through every inch of her property. What they found painted a deeply troubling picture. Bloodstains found at the scene were confirmed to be Nancy's. The blood near the front door was extensive enough to be visible in media footage shot from across the street. Whatever had happened to Nancy as she left that house, or as she was taken from it, it had not been gentle. Investigators confirmed that the doorbell camera had been removed and that personal items had been left behind, factors that contributed to the assessment that Guthrie was taken against her will. Her phone was there. Her daily medications, critical for an 84-year-old with a pacemaker, were untouched. Investigators noted that Guthrie's pacemaker ceased synchronizing with her Apple Watch at approximately 2:28 a.m. on the night she went missing. This was the last digital trace of her. After that moment, she simply ceased to appear in any record. No phone signal, no pacemaker ping, no credit card transaction. Nothing. DNA was recovered from inside the house and from outside. Neither sample registered a match in CODIS, the nationwide combined DNA index system which holds more than 19 million offender profiles. Investigators also found a pair of black gloves about 2 miles from Guthrie's home in roadside brush. The gloves appeared similar to those worn by the suspect captured on the doorbell camera. DNA lifted from the gloves also initially failed to match CODIS. Investigators were hopeful, but those hopes were about to be complicated. 10 days into the investigation, on February 10, 2026, the case shifted in a way that sent shockwaves across the country. FBI Director Kash Patel released still images along with a short video from a Google Nest doorbell camera showing an armed individual wearing a mask and carrying a backpack tampering with the doorbell camera on Nancy's property prior to her disappearance. The footage was chilling. It showed a masked man with a flashlight in his mouth outside the door, deliberately covering the camera with a nearby shrub. He was methodical, deliberate. He knew exactly what he was doing. He also said the intruder was armed with an apparent gun placed in a holster over his crotch area, worn improperly but unmistakably a weapon. On February 12th, the FBI released additional identifying details. The suspect was a man of average build, approximately 5 feet 9 inches to 5 feet 10 inches tall, with a black mustache, and was carrying a 25-liter black Ozark Trail hiker pack backpack. The FBI's Phoenix office posted photos of the specific backpack model to X, asking the public to help identify the buyer. Savannah Guthrie posted the images to her Instagram account with the message, "We believe she is still alive. Or bring her home." But here was the detail that made investigators pause. Sources familiar with the investigation told ABC News on February 23rd that the masked suspect appeared to have been at Nancy Guthrie's front door earlier than February 1st. Before the night, she vanished. The image the FBI released of the suspect without a backpack was captured on a separate, earlier visit. He had not come once. He had been there before. He had scoped the location. He had studied her routine. This was not a crime of opportunity. It was a crime of calculation. While forensic teams worked the scene, something else was happening, something that would simultaneously energize and confuse the investigation. Multiple ransom notes of undetermined origin began appearing, demanding payment in cryptocurrency, with 2 deadlines that had passed by February 9th. At least 3 news outlets said they received ransom notes referring to Guthrie. NBC News reviewed a copy of one note, and its contents were consistent with descriptions provided by the FBI and other outlets. One ransom demand was for $6 million with a deadline of 5 p.m. on February 9th. The absence of direct communication with the possible kidnapper and the lack of a clear ransom channel were described by former FBI agents as highly unusual. In typical kidnapping cases, demands come directly to the family through a private channel. These notes were going to media organizations, a behavior that baffled profilers. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos confirmed law enforcement was aware of the ransom notes and said all tips and materials were being forwarded to detectives working with the FBI. Then, on February 7th, there came a development that complicated everything. A California man was arrested on federal charges alleging that he had posed as an abductor and demanded ransom from the Guthrie family. Authorities stated that this scheme was unrelated to the other ransom demands that had received wide publicity. That man was identified as Derek Colella of Los Angeles. So now investigators faced a nightmare scenario. Some of the ransom notes were fake. But were all of them fake? In an interview with NBC's Hoda Kotb, Savannah Guthrie stated that she believes 2 of the ransom notes are legitimate. The family issued a public response through social media. Savannah, Annie, and Cameron Guthrie appeared together in a video. "We received your message and we understand. We beg you now to return our mother to us. This is very valuable to us, and we will pay. The deadline's passed. No payment was made. No proof of life arrived." On the evening of February 10th, 2026, the same day the FBI released the doorbell camera footage, something significant happened 60 miles south of Tucson. During the evening, a person of interest was detained for questioning following a traffic stop in Rio Rico, Arizona. Shortly afterward, the Pima County Sheriff's Department and FBI executed a search warrant on a property and vehicle in the same area. Law enforcement sources told ABC News that the man was detained after the FBI identified him using a series of electronic investigative tools, including phone usage information and traffic data. The man's home was searched and he was questioned for several hours. The nation held its breath. Then came the deflating news. The man was released without charges. There was no arrest and no sign of Guthrie. It was the first of what would become a recurring pattern in this case, a surge of hope, followed by silence. The Rio Rico lead evaporated, but what the FBI had demonstrated was that they were still actively pursuing electronic trails, still tracking movement patterns, still running down every digital footprint in the weeks after Nancy vanished. The investigation was far from idle, but it was also far from solved. In the days that followed the release of the doorbell footage, investigators were working a lead that seemed promising. Black gloves had been found in February about 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home, in roadside brush. They appeared similar to the type worn by the suspect caught on the doorbell camera. Investigators lifted DNA of an unknown male profile from the gloves. The gloves appeared to generically match the kind worn by the suspect in the footage. The Sheriff's Department sent the gloves to a lab before entering them into the FBI's National DNA Database, but the result was devastating. The DNA from the gloves did not register any matches in CODIS, and it did not match the DNA found at Guthrie's home either. Then came a further blow. The gloves were eventually traced by DNA to a local restaurant worker who is not part of this investigation, the Pima County Sheriff's Department confirmed. The gloves were a coincidence. A piece of evidence that had seemed to tie directly to the suspect turned out to belong to someone with no connection to the crime. Investigators were forced to step back and regroup. Nanos noted that nothing in the investigation, none of the DNA collected, had any matches in CODIS. Investigators were looking at other genetic genealogy options to check for matches with the DNA evidence, noting that CODIS is just one of several available databases. The DNA was there. The suspect's genetic profile almost certainly existed somewhere in that evidence. But finding the match was proving to be a longer, harder road than anyone had hoped. As February turned into March, the Guthrie family made a decision. They were not going to wait quietly. They were going to fight publicly, loudly, and with everything they had. On February 24th, Savannah Guthrie released a video announcing her family's offer of a $1 million reward for information that assists in Nancy's recovery, acknowledging that their mother may have already died, though they remained hopeful. Around the same time, the family donated $500,000 to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children as a way to support other families going through a similar situation. The reward announcement was strategically timed. A law enforcement source noted that the strategy of holding back the large reward until the moment it was needed to re-energize the lead bucket was deliberate and had produced new, viable leads. Savannah Guthrie spoke directly to camera in an Instagram video, her voice breaking. "We are at an hour of desperation, and we need your help," she said. She addressed whoever was holding her mother, or whoever knew where she was, with raw, unfiltered grief and resolve. Her siblings, Annie and Cameron Guthrie, stood beside her in multiple video appeals. Together in their grief, together in their demand for answers. As the weeks passed, the color yellow became a symbol of the search. Savannah wore yellow on her return to the Today set. The studio was adorned with yellow flowers. Craig Melvin, her co-anchor, wore yellow in solidarity. NBC personalities, including Hoda Kotb, wore yellow ribbons on air. Yellow ribbons appeared on streetlights and fences near Nancy's home. Yellow, the color of hope. But hope was being tested every single day. As February wore on, new threads emerged from the investigation, some bizarre, some potentially significant. Authorities began searching the roof of Nancy Guthrie's Arizona home after a neighbor's observation provided what was described as a critical new direction. The detail was stark, a roof that appeared to a neighbor to be unusually clean. Whether this observation produced any concrete evidence was never publicly confirmed by investigators. An SUV was seized as a new ransom message was being probed. Details about this seizure remained sparse in public reporting, but it indicated investigators were actively pursuing vehicle-based leads. On February 18th, Google announced it was trying to extract additional footage from the various home cameras. This was significant. The doorbell camera had been physically removed, and its subscription had lapsed, meaning initial footage retrieval had been complicated. But Google, as the owner of the Nest system, was working at a forensic level to recover whatever data existed. Investigators were also visiting gun shops in the Tucson area. The suspect had been seen in the doorbell video with a gun and a holster that the sheriff noted had some pretty distinctive characteristics. If the gun could be traced to a purchase, even a private sale, it could blow the case open. And then President Donald Trump made a statement that sent the internet into overdrive. Trump told reporters aboard Air Force One, "We have some clues that I think are very strong, and I think we could have some answers coming up fairly soon." When asked if authorities had identified a suspect, he replied, "Yeah, could be definitive." No arrest followed. No announcement was made. The nation waited. While the physical search continued, forensic scientists and genetic genealogists were watching the case closely. One detail caught the attention of C.C. Moore, one of the most respected genetic genealogists in the United States. Moore told NewsNation that the flashlight visible in the masked man's mouth in the doorbell footage was a potentially crucial detail that investigators could not afford to ignore. DNA is hardy, so it's certainly possible there's still some DNA there, Moore said. In particular, I really do think that saliva is the most likely, because of what appeared to be that flashlight in his mouth. She added that someone who had written to her pointed out it would be impossible not to leave any saliva behind from that detail. This was not a small observation. If investigators had swabbed that area of the doorbell or the surrounding shrub, wherever that flashlight may have made contact, there was a meaningful chance that the suspect's saliva DNA was sitting in a forensic lab somewhere, waiting to be matched. Moore said she had faith in the crime scene investigators, calling them very skilled. But she acknowledged, they may not have swabbed the exact right thing to find that individual's DNA through no fault of their own. It's just hard in a house like that. As one forensics expert noted, every time someone is arrested on a felony charge somewhere and that data is loaded into CODIS, That's one more chance for a match. The databases grow every day. The science does not give up. And investigators were simultaneously exploring genetic genealogy databases beyond CODIS, the same technology that cracked the Golden State Killer case. With no arrest and no confirmed identity for the suspect, investigators and experts began to wrestle publicly with the most fundamental question of the entire case. Why Nancy Guthrie? She was an 84-year-old woman living alone in a wealthy neighborhood. She was not herself a public figure. She did not control significant financial assets. So why had someone targeted her so specifically, so deliberately, with so much advanced planning? Dr. Ann Burgess, a researcher and psychiatric clinical nurse specialist who had spent years working with the FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit, offered a disturbing analysis. So she told News Nation's Brian Enton that the motive behind Nancy Guthrie's disappearance could be connected to retribution. I think something went very wrong inside the house. Because there was blood, Burgess said. Who in her orbit, family, friends, would be hurt the most? And I think you can answer. It's a very mean, angry, horrible thing to do. The retribution theory was significant. If the target was not Nancy Guthrie for her own sake, but as a weapon against someone else, perhaps someone in her family's orbit, perhaps someone connected to her famous daughter's career in media and news, then the pool of potential suspects became simultaneously wider and more specific. The Pima County Sheriff's Department confirmed that the Guthrie family, including all siblings and spouses, had been cleared as possible suspects. The Guthrie family are victims, plain and simple, the statement read. But the retribution theory lingered. Someone had planned this. Someone had a reason. And that reason, whatever it was, remained locked inside the mind of a masked man who had never been found. As weeks stretched into months with no arrest, scrutiny began to turn inward, toward the investigation itself. Fox News reported that the lead investigator in the Nancy Guthrie case had no homicide experience. For a case of this magnitude, a suspected kidnapping with a high-profile victim, FBI involvement, and national attention, that revelation was startling to many observers. The Pima County Board of Supervisors voted unanimously to question Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos about his work history and his management of the department. But an independent firm working for Pima County also released findings into a workplace harassment complaint against Sheriff Nanos, brought by a former Sheriff's Department lieutenant who had lost to Nanos in the 2024 election. These revelations opened a painful question. Had investigative missteps in the early hours and days of the case allowed crucial evidence to slip away? The case had been marked by, among other things, technical forensic snags stalling the FBI's progress, according to Fox 10 Phoenix. The lapsed subscription on the doorbell camera had complicated footage retrieval. The early search for the gloves had ultimately led nowhere. The detained man in Rio Rico had been released. Critics argued that in a case where the first 48 hours are critical, every delay, every misstep, on every inexperienced investigator making a judgment call could be the difference between finding Nancy Guthrie alive and finding out too late. The FBI was working alongside the Sheriff's Department, but the question of who was truly leading and how effectively was one the public and the press refused to drop. By mid-March, a significant development signaled a shift in the investigation's center of gravity. News broke that the FBI was shifting its command post from Tucson to Phoenix. This was a logistical change that some read as a sign the case was cooling, but investigators pushed back on that interpretation. This is nowhere near a cold case, one law enforcement source told CNN. They still have leads that are viable that they need to get to. There is still plenty of science that is out that hasn't come back yet. There are still investigators working leads they're not finished with. The FBI's role had expanded significantly from the outset. FBI Special Agent in Charge Hythyanka had been present at press conferences from the early days of the investigation. The Bureau had taken a $50,000 federal reward. The tip line, 1-800-CALL-FBI, was being promoted nationally. The physical presence in Tucson had faded. The media trucks had left. The cameras had moved on to other stories, but the investigation continued. DNA was still in labs. Tips were still being processed. Digital evidence was still being analyzed. The Guthrie family urged the public for renewed attention to the case in a statement on March 21st, saying, "No detail is too small. 60 days in, 70 days in, still no arrest, still no Nancy." On Monday, April 6th, 2026, 65 days after her mother disappeared, Savannah Guthrie walked back onto the set of The Today Show. Opening the broadcast, she acknowledged the audience. "Good morning. Welcome to Today on this Monday morning. We are so glad you started your week with us, and it is good to be home." Her co-anchor Craig Melvin replied, "Yes, it is good to have you back at home." Savannah wore a bright yellow dress. The studio was adorned with yellow flowers. Craig wore yellow as a nod to his co-host's missing mother. It was one of the most emotionally loaded moments in daytime television in years. Savannah did not speak directly about her mother on air. Producers had reportedly implemented strict procedures for handling any news about the investigation that might break during the program. This included sequestering Savannah from the set and having another anchor handle any breaking developments on air. But the yellow dress said everything. The yellow flowers said everything. Her presence on that set, choosing to come back, choosing to keep working, choosing to face the camera while her mother remained missing, was an act of extraordinary courage. The search continued. The leads continued. And somewhere out there, the man in the mask had still not been found. As the investigation stretched past the 2-month mark, new ransom notes continued to surface. TMZ reported it had received another note in the case, with the sender claiming they had seen Nancy in Mexico. Law enforcement did not verify the claim. The proximity of Tucson to the U.S.-Mexico border had been a focus of the investigation from the beginning. Investigators had briefed U.S. Border Patrol agents and Mexican law enforcement authorities. Officials on both sides of the border were told to be on the lookout for clues that might assist in the case. But the claim in the TMZ note remained unsubstantiated. Detective Brian Martin of the Fort Wayne Police Department in Indiana, a cold case specialist, warned that notes sent to media outlets rather than to law enforcement or the family raised serious concerns. Whoever sent the letters obviously wants the letters to be found, or they wouldn't have sent them to a news outlet, Martin said. I would hope that if it is the person involved in Miss Guthrie's disappearance, they want to be heard and are legitimately trying to negotiate some type of deal. Martin also raised the possibility that bad faith notes from people with no connection to the crime were diverting investigators down wrong paths. You get somebody like that, and it's going to take this case down a completely wrong path, away from Miss Guthrie, he warned. The challenge investigators faced was this. Every note had to be taken seriously. Every note had to be investigated. And every fake note cost time, resources, and attention that could have been pointed somewhere real. As April arrived and Nancy Guthrie had been missing for more than 70 days, the nation's experts began to speak more openly about what many privately feared. A detective, Brian Martin, articulated the grim theory that had been haunting the case. What really bothers me is if they underestimated Miss Guthrie's health and thought, well, we'll take her, this will be easy. We'll hold on to her at an unknown location for a day or two. We'll get some money out of this, and we'll leave her in a Walmart parking lot. He pointed to the fact that Guthrie's pacemaker stopped syncing with her Apple Watch around 2 a.m. on the night she disappeared. Martin suggested a sudden health crisis could have completely changed the course of events for the kidnappers. And what they had to do is, it sounds horrible, they had to dispose of Miss Guthrie because she was no longer of value to them in that monetary gain that they're hoping to get, Martin said. Dr. Ann Burgess echoed a version of this concern. It just scares me to think that somebody maybe took Miss Guthrie, and she had some sort of medical event when it was happening, because obviously it would be an incredibly stressful situation and very taxing on somebody. By February 24th, Savannah publicly acknowledged that the family understood their mother had possibly already died, though they remained hopeful. This was grief made public in real time, a family holding two truths at once, the hope that their mother was alive and the terrifying acknowledgement that she might not be. And with no body found, no confirmed fate, and no suspect named, neither truth could be confirmed. As of April 15th, 2026, 74 days since Nancy Guthrie was taken from her home in the Catalina foothills of Tucson, Arizona, she has not been located. The investigation remains ongoing. No suspect has been arrested. No formal charges have been filed. The evidence is still in labs. DNA analysis continues. The genetic profile lifted from the crime scene does not match CODIS, but investigators are exploring genealogy databases that go far beyond the federal system. C.C. Moore, the genetic genealogist, believes that saliva DNA from the flashlight in the suspect's mouth may yet be the key that unlocks his identity. The masked man seen on the doorbell footage, average build, 5 feet 9 inches to 5 feet 10 inches tall, black mustache, Ozark Trail backpack, remains unidentified. His image has been seen by millions of people across the world. Someone knows who he is. The Guthrie family's reward of $1 million for information leading to Nancy's safe recovery remains active. The FBI tip line, 1-800-CALL-FBI, remains open. Our investigators say this is still not a cold case. New leads are still coming in, science is still running, the investigation has not stopped. But Nancy Guthrie, a woman of faith, a woman who spent her Saturday evenings with family, a woman who had spent 84 years building a life in this world, is still out there. Somewhere. And every day she is not found is a day her family wakes up not knowing whether she is alive or gone, not knowing whether she is safe or suffering, not knowing whether justice is coming or whether the man who walked up to her front door with a mask on his face and a gun on his hip will ever be made to answer for what he did. If you know anything at all about this case, contact the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI. Someone out there has information. One call could bring Nancy home.